Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Five podcast. I am joined by Nexus Humectress. I first heard about you on Keith Preston's Attack the System podcast. I think it was one of the last podcasts he did under his own name. And you had mentioned your sort of critique of progressive woke culture and how now a lot of the assumptions don't seem to make sense. Either you or Keith brought up, how does a white beggar on the street have privilege, whereas a black woman who's a CEO is oppressed? It just doesn't make sense anymore. And I thought that was an interesting. And you had also come from an intentional community, and so I thought, oh, that was kind of interesting. And then we reached out and talked about a little bit privately a couple of weeks ago, and I thought, yeah, this might be interesting to have something to talk about. So you had mentioned that Keith Preston said in an earlier stream of ours that the progressives are sort of like, or the SJWs are sort of like Christianity without Christ. So there's a lot of ways we could go with that. So why don't we open it up for you?
Yeah, I thought that was a real interesting angle because now I'm hoping I'm keeping my fingers crossed that the context of this discussion we're having is moot now that everything has been subsumed under coronavirus. And I've had some heard some people saying that woke is dead and that we don't need to worry about that anymore. They've all just disappeared. But I don't think the social justice warriors have disappeared. I think they're just biding their time and finding a way to reemerge. What do you think?
Oh yeah, I'll give you an example. So on YouTube, there were the skeptic community morphed around 2013, 2014 to doing a lot of anti-feminist videos.
Yeah, I
Uh,
remember that.
and it looked like that for a while, the progressive establishment, which at the time was led by people like Christy Winters and Anita Sarkeesian, had been defeated. But then within the last couple of years, BreadTube just came out of nowhere with
Mhm.
all of these very, slick videos, people that ginned up a lot of support, and even a revival of tankyism in some cases. And it's like, it came back. It looked like it had been defeated, but really, one what was defeated was a certain presentation. A
Mhm.
certain presentation had been defeated, but the core beliefs are still there. It's just been repackaged. So someone like ContraPoints is a lot more theatrical and entertaining, whereas Anita Sarkeesian had kind of like a finger wagging schoolmarm aspect to her that off put a lot of people. So it's just new packaging, but it seems to work. You also got like Ben Burgess from Zero Books, who's kind of like this fuddy duddy professor that sort of puts you at ease, and you kind of want to listen to what he has to say. They sort of learned how to package it better. And so I think now that this is totally analogous to the comeback with BreadTube, but I think that when a crisis or some sort of setback occurs and they withdraw from the scenes, it doesn't mean they're not going to come back.
Yeah, I guess especially since they've already got their ideology and fully ensconced in academia and the corporate culture and a lot of the government as well and the media. So that's not going to disappear overnight.
That's actually, I think, one of the more interesting questions about SJWs and progressives. So I remember from the early '90s all the way up until 2011 that the hard left was anti-globalist. Lots of Occupy Wall Street,
Yeah.
G20 protests, and they would say that all of their victim hierarchy groups were whatever that was. The platform was take down capitalism.
Yeah, I remember that. Like the World Trade Organization protest and all the other anti-globalization protests in 1999 and 2000 and 2001. They were all anti-globalization and uh, and I remember it's such a stark difference to see now that now that the corporations like Google and Apple are promising to do their due censorship and control the narrative and control what facts people are allowed to hear as legitimate facts, then they're getting mostly uncritical praise from the same people who would have said corporate domination is ruining the world.
Exactly. And what's so bizarre about this is, how, on the one hand, the cynic in me is like, well, they never meant it in the first place, and this was just a power grab, and now we're seeing their true colors, which is one explanation and probably does account for a lot of people. But there are some people that are harder to account for, like Noam Chomsky, for example. It's harder to account for his flip because he made his entire career after his professional linguistic studies as a critique of the corporate US imperialist structure. And now he's just walked in lockstep because it's apparently woke, I guess.
Yeah, he's always been a conundrum. He says that the roots of his ideology is radical, yet everything he does is liberal and tepid reform in terms of what he's actually recommending. And he's just this week he was trying to get out the vote for Biden, and as if that was meaningful in some way. And so yeah, I think in some I think Chomsky's shtick, it was a good shtick while it lasted, but it was based on a really easy proposition, which was like shooting fish in a barrel, which was, let's find hypocrisy in U.S. foreign policy, and he found plenty of it because there was lots of it there. And that gets him praised as a genius, where really he's just pointing out the absolute obvious if anyone takes the chance to take a look at it.
Well, yeah. And I think also, though maybe at the time it didn't immediately negatively affect him, but his really unconscionable defense of the Khmer Rouge really does hurts his reputation. I mean, even basically, he said after 75, when it was conquered by Vietnam and then all the private information was released, he said, well, I was wrong in an absolute sense, but at the time, I was right because I was working on the best information I had. And I'm like, nobody under any other circumstance could make that appeal. But Noam Chomsky did, and he got away with it, at least for a while.
Oh, that's sad. That's pretty sad.
It is. But I think this gets to the real issue. How radical was the radical left? Because you, as you mentioned, Chomsky he claims he's radical. He claims, anarchists as his backdrop, but he's not very radical at all in actual practice. And in fact, he was called out for this by the post-left anarchist Bob Black, who had a whole long essay just blasting Chomsky as a bourgeois liberal who just appropriated anarchism. And a lot of it was tongue-in-cheek, but I also think Bob Black wasn't entirely wrong either.
Oh yeah, Bob Black's always been very insightful on that kind of thing, and I think people like you and I can absorb kind of harsh truths that other people might be resistant to hearing by just the mere fact of being willing to not go along with a group and not seek belonging and acceptance, and to if that's not a super high priority, then and if you're willing to take the risk of being ostracized, then you can discover all sorts of things that other people are unwilling to see, or they see it but they're unwilling to say it.
Exactly. One of the themes that Keith Preston and I have covered a lot, and I think indicates that the radical left isn't really all that radical. If you look at the twin pillars of the liberation salvation narrative that the United States military garbs itself in, as well as the sort of heavy-handed tactics of imperial domination, both of which originate in the Civil War. The idea of a liberatory conquest, Christ died to save men's souls, but we die to make men free. that was then reappropriated in World War I and reappropriated in World War II. And it's really just been a constant theme for the last, 60, 70 years, justifying whatever America does. And while the left might cry crocodile tears about the Sioux Indians or the Moro and the Philippines, the same tactics were pioneered in the American South by Sherman and Grant, and they don't seem to mind that too much. And so really, if the Civil War is in all of the things that go into that are what sort of laid the track for the U.S. empire and everything that they profess to dislike, but they fail to come to grips with that, how radical can they truly be?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how the left was seduced from being anti-war as recently as the George W. Bush administration to being tepidly pro-war, or at least silent during the Obama reign, and then more recently criticizing Donald Trump for not being bellicose enough against Syria or Russia.
Yeah, it's almost like once one of the things that I've noticed that most people on the left don't do, at least they only do it selectively rather, is you need to identify a nexus of where something starts, and then you go after it. Well, where did the U.S. empire start? It starts in the U.S. Civil War with a lot of the decisions that Lincoln made. And if now, to his credit, Howard Zinn in the People's History of the United States and elsewhere does take a more critical eye of the decisions Lincoln made and of the precedent that he set. But most won't do that. I'll give you another example. Howard Zinn was asked about World War II, and he said, well, in light of all the death and destruction that happened, and he was a bomber pilot in the war, that the United States probably shouldn't have fought it. In the long run, more bad resulted from it. Noam Chomsky was asked the same question, and he's like, well, what do you want? You want Hitler to win? And I'm like, okay, that pretty much sums it up in a nutshell. Someone like Howard Zinn, who's more thoughtful, more honest, doesn't seem to have the same cachet as a Noam Chomsky or some of these other thinkers.
I could share with you a funny anecdote about Howard Zinn. I went to attend a Howard Zinn speech one time in a theater, and and as I'm waiting for the show to begin, Howard Zinn comes down the aisle and he sits in the chair next to me. And I was like, what are you doing here? Are you sitting here in order to get a good view of the speech up on the stage there? And he says, yeah, I'm going to applaud.
I think another element too that we see is if we look at Murray Bookchin, who initially started off as a pretty much by the book, anarcho-communist, anarcho-syndicalist. But by the end of his life, he was almost post-left, almost a post-left anarchist. He said that in his last interview that anarchism is an individualist philosophy, and he looked to the likes of Stirner and Spooner rather than the more collectivist philosophy of anarchists that he identified with someone like a Noam Chomsky.
My God, I never heard that. Does that mean did he change his tune on the so-called lifestylist?
I don't remember. I can send a link in the low notes, but yeah, in his last interview that he ever gave in 2002, it was, he said, yeah, anarchism is an individualist philosophy, Spooner and Stirner, and guys like them, we don't need syndicalism because that's collectivism. And I'm like, wow, okay. But what he said was he does something that anarchists never do, which is why he's hated for it. He looked at actual historical examples of decentralized democratic societies. And he's like, well, the two examples that he drew inspiration from were Athens and New England. And he's like, look, they may not be everything that we want, but these are the closest historical examples that we can look to. And how do we apply that practically? And people were saying he's not an anarchist, he's a statist. But again, Murray Bookchin's legacy is the PKK. So he's had the most practical legacy of any anarchist thinker in the modern age. And in part, that's because he took, I think, a practical historical analysis of things And again, we don't see a lot of leftists take this kind of, and even when they begin to think this way, they kind of stop being leftist, because Bookchin was post-left by the end.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing, and I think the political correctness has, at least in the English-speaking world, has a lot to do with that, and I think the reason the political correctness has as much sticking power as it does is that it emulates the template of Christianity and pulls on the same, on not all the same strings, but it pulls on a lot of the same emotional hooks, in terms of seeking some kind of redemption, some kind of transcendence in terms of being part of something bigger, and definitely in terms of the original sin of privilege, and going through a process of saying I'm not worthy, but if I participate in this political movement, I can become a worthwhile person, do you see those same parallels?
Yeah, one of the things that I think what Stirner said in Ego and His Own, the atheists of his day, and arguably of our day too, are still essentially crypto Christians of a kind, and he calls them very, very pious atheists. And there's two things that have happened, I think. One thing is that the left has sort of tailored its rhetoric to be, rather than a direct assault on Christianity, like the communists did in Russia and in Spain, and the Jacobins did in France, over the last 60 years, they've taken a more indirect attack, where instead of directly attacking it, they've tried to appropriate it and also subvert it. So things like liberation theology, they'll use all the language and concepts of Christian theology, in this case Catholic theology, but then they'll impute into it all these Marxist concepts, and it's kind of a bait and switch. So they're doing two things, I think. They're on the one hand changing how they market their ideas to trigger the same responses from left-wing, from Christian people, but then they're also subtly, in 1984 style with Newspeak, changing what the words mean in our language without us really even realizing it.
Oh yeah, and I'd say chief among those word changes is the definition of racism, whereas it used to very concretely mean someone who believes in the racial superiority, typically of their own race, and has that as a belief system and acts based on that conscious belief system, and you fast forward to the rhetoric of the so-called putative anti-racists of today, and they're just saying that there are structural inequalities and sort of ephemeral advantages that are difficult to identify or pin down, but and if you acknowledge that there are any differentials in life outcomes on average between different groups, then they say that's proof of the privilege. And you would think that, logically speaking, that train of thought would say, well, if there's a structural problem, a structural inequality to remedy, the natural thing to do would be to put all your focus on structures and reforming structures. But no, they turn it all back onto the person, back into a personal guilt trip, saying that you, as the individual, you have the privilege, and there's nothing you can do to ever atone for it, and there's nothing you can do to fix it, there's nothing you can do to ameliorate it. The only thing you can do is promulgate our ideology and get more converts. And have you seen that same thing going up?
Oh yeah, I think in this regard too, I think what Keith was getting at is it operates like a religion, in the sense that it imputes guilt to a certain group of people. But unlike normal religions, there's really no absolution. So Peter Boghossian talks about the idea of the F it line, where at some point people just say, okay, we're done. We don't care anymore. Now, what religions do when they're healthy is they have a process of bringing the person back into the community. So like with Christianity, that's with penance and confession, and then you can come back in. whether it's through the original sin you were born with or through some later transgression that you have to atone for. Whereas with this, there really is no way to atone for anything. And I think one of the reasons why that's the case is people who are guilty and feel like they need to appease someone or something else, and they're kept in that state in perpetuity, makes them easier to control. So it's like, well, there's nothing I could ever do to make it work. So either, well, what ends up happening is either they just say F it and they throw the shackles off, or they just, sort of exhibit a Stockholm Syndrome where they just try to, relate to their oppressor throughout their entire life.
Yeah, this was hard for me to believe when I witnessed it personally. But I was at a conference where people were taking turns speaking, and this woman took the floor, and she says that it took her a long time to understand it, but she's finally come to terms with the fact that she is a white supremacist, and she feels very bad about it. And I looked over to her husband, who was black, and thought that there's got to be some mangling of definitions here for this white woman married to a black man to think that she's a white supremacist, and going to the most extreme designation of hatred there, which I'm sure she doesn't harbor, but she feels that she has to publicly admit to it in order to get acceptance from the rest of the SJWs.
Exactly. And I think this is actually kind of a nice segue to the other topic we wanted to talk about, which is the pornographication of culture. So basically what we have now is what you just said. It's expressing a feeling to then get a reaction from other people to then give you a feeling of accomplishment or whatever. And so pornography is a similitude of the real thing. It offers the quote payout of the real thing without doing it. But everybody does that now, and we call that virtue signaling. So instead of actually going out to help a real flesh and blood person and then feeling good about it, you profess a concern for somebody you'll never meet, and you'll feel the same way as if you actually helped them. And I actually don't think they're not. I think they are related. I think what happens is we have this way of looking at human sexuality with pornography, and then it affects how we look at everything else. Where everything else is, we want the dopamine hit without the work.
Yeah, it's I guess like I'm sure Jean Baudrillard, the postmodernist, would call it a simulation, because it's going through the motions. It's not just an imitation or a illusion, but it's as much as possible trying to go through the motions and pretend you're actually doing it like some kind of street theater. But nonetheless, it's totally fake and contrived.
Exactly. And what ends up happening is, I mean, it was all one thing for people to be criticized for being self-righteous because they felt what they did was more valuable than what it was. Okay, that's one thing. But now we have self-righteous people that didn't actually do anything except say the right thing, which is a whole nother level of self-righteous obnoxiousness.
Yeah, like we have college student SJW activists who are chanting this long chant that includes the phrase, "We have nothing to lose but our chains." And the absurdity of pampered college students thinking they're in chains is it defies words, unless somehow they were focused on the specific conditions of their studenthood, which they're not at all.
Well, the actual chains they would have are debt, but that's not probably the context under which they were making that protest. And yeah, this is where this also is related to another topic in a discussion I had with Keith Preston and Derek Jensen, which you watch, and is where if you have people that need each other, you can't afford to just blow them off because you might need their help in the future. But with the commodification of society, we have professionals to do it with these transactions. And so we don't really need our neighbor or even the guy down, the road to help us out, so we can safely, at least we think we can, safely ignore them. And that also, I think, makes it difficult to have these real, meaningful expressions and engagements that would lead to the real dopamine payout, right? Rather than actually helping your neighbor down the road and you feel good about it. Well, you should feel good about it. That's the incentive to do it again. And if we actually did more of that, that would go a long way to solving some of these issues. But the problem is we've been trained into thinking that those things don't matter. And furthermore, they're hard. And so we don't want to do things that are hard anymore. And these simulations are far easier to engage in. But we're beginning to see, though, that even though it can supervene the same level of dopamine satisfaction, the actual glue that holds society together is beginning to come apart, and that it's not really an adequate replacement for what came before.
Yeah, I think Twitter has destroyed our society, and it's had ramifications that go way beyond just Twitter itself. It seems like people are bringing those kinds of attitudes and the social mobbing into real life far too often.
Oh,
I was saying you've gone silent. I don't know if your mic is still
there you
on.
go. Sorry. There you go.
Now I hear you.
Yeah. So when the internet was transitioning from more of a public thing, creature of the government, to a private enterprise, there was this idea that the internet would liberate us and lead to a new renaissance. And one of the things that's just absurd is you look at social media and you look at how people are, to quote the Adam Smith quote that Chomsky loves to quote, social media makes man as stupid as is possible for a man to become. And it's the exact opposite of what they were telling us. Rather than leading to a new renaissance, it's almost led us into a new dark age where people can't even string together a grammatic sentence.
I think it was different in the far early days of the internet, where you only had extremely dedicated nerds who were willing to get all the equipment together and jump through all the hoops in order to get online. And then as it became more and more popularized, you had more of the masses are asses effect, and then it got stupider from there.
Yeah, the process of democratization, that is one of the problems. We think of any fandom. Think of like the Lord of the Rings or H.P. Lovecraft. When it started, it was a very niche thing, and it could be fairly deep and sophisticated and even offensive to some people. But as they got more and more popular, Lord of the Rings because of the movies, H.P. Lovecraft, I think in largely part because of nerd culture in general and the tropes that was appropriated, it's been watered down into something very milquetoast and almost unrecognizable from what the creators would have had.
And sure, and then on the right wing, you've got 4chan, which has memeified anything on the right-hand side of the spectrum, and then it's hard to make a coherent intellectual argument based on some cartoons.
Well, exactly. The memes, social media, all of this. One of the things that we're seeing is the sort of image-based culture. So you might say that the United States up until the 20th century was a ocular culture. It was about hearing. It was, the spoken word, whether that was a presidential speech or whether it was a sermon from the pulpit. It was the spoken word and the written word that were what dominated American life. Beginning in the 20th century with cinema, we have an image-based culture. So we have ads, we have cinema. And now you had to go out of your house to see all that stuff. Now we can just port all these images, moving and otherwise, into our own room, into our house. And there seems to be an innervation of society that when you have all of these images, it's a substitute for actual thinking. So when we go back to the pictographs of prehistoric man, we say, well, then we have hieroglyphs, then we have, letters, and then we have written words. And so we are on this evolutionary process from pictographs to written word. Well, we've reverted back to pictographs. And what's ended up happening is this inundation of images. And it's not just sensory overload, that's another issue. But you can't have a conversation with pictures. And that's why prehistoric man didn't get anywhere.
Yeah, the emojis have taken over.
Yeah.
And now we all rue the day.
Exactly. And so I think one of the critiques that can also be made is the inundation of images, and because images, there's that saying that, there's a painting that speaks 1,000 words. So you can really communicate a lot directly, instantaneously with an image. And one of the problems is that an image-based culture, let's say it's the ancient pagan Romans with all their temples and idols and whatever, and then the Catholic Church with all of its, sort of religious theater, and then today, it really favors the powerful because the weak cannot muster the financial resources to make images as good as the powerful.
Yeah, it's true. I think even the for instance, in the massacre in Nice, France, there were some people trying to spread around photographs of the massacre victims, but they never spread anywhere near as far as wide as the official news reports that banned those kind of images. And yeah, so we have that, and then on the other hand, we have the images that we did get to see, such as Michael Brown, and that becomes the iconic moment that grabs people on a visceral level, and then we get back into the religious aspect of they're taking what images they see and they feel sympathy towards and putting it on the template that's given to them by Christianity, whether they've were Christians themselves or just influenced by a Christian-based culture of seeing an innocent persecuted victim and projecting all these qualities onto that person, which they might not actually have, like such as a moral innocence and some kind of righteousness and some kind of redemption, and and to use another example, in front of the Supreme Court, there were protesters when Brett Kavanaugh was getting grilled in front of the Congress, and they were holding up signs saying "Believe all women," and the emphasis was on belief, as in blind faith. And I think that's another religious aspect that deserves additional scrutiny.
Unless, of course, it's Bill Clinton, in which case, don't believe all women because they're trying to torpedo Bill Clinton's career. But yeah, this idea that in a lot of ways, like what we would have seen in ancient societies or the Middle Ages, where the priest has this sort of unquestioned trust, and that everybody believes what he says because he is the priest. That kind of thinking, that kind of relationship hasn't gone away. It's been transferred to another group of people. And, we could say it's university professors, it's activists, it's whatever, but that way of thinking hasn't gone away. We just have a different kind of priesthood. I would argue it's a technocratic priesthood where we have these professionals, and who are like, well, we have to trust the professionals because, reasons.
Yeah. One thing I take heart in is now that the celebrities are trapped in their homes and are stuck making webcam videos just like we are, then they've suddenly been brought down to the level that the rest of us are in terms of production quality. And now we can see who has innate talent and who is less talented than your average popular YouTuber. And maybe that'll all get reset once the quarantine's over. But I do hold out a little hope that that the undue respect that the public has put on to these high and mighty figures in the mass media, that maybe that's gonna crumble or at least be diminished now that we've seen what they're like with their makeup off and without the intense production quality.
Yeah, that would be nice to see, and hopefully there will be this process of waking up to the true nature of what it is. But I do want to double back on this point, which about how art, especially overly visual art, is a weapon of the powerful to keep us oppressed. Whether it's libertarians or anarchists or dissidents, really of any kind, they tend to really like the use of images, gaudy images or shocking images, and they think that that's a way they can push back against the status quo. But I think the problem is it's always going to be the people that have all the money and the power that can make the best use out of images, because what images allow you to do is it tricks people. It bypasses their rational faculties to hit them in a sort of primal sense. Rather, you're not saying, here's a proposition, here are the arguments for the proposition, do you assent to the proposition? No, you have a certain response you want to get out of these people, and you hit them in the gut with this primal force to get it. And if you look at the past 30 years, it works when the government does it, and it works when corporations do it, but it doesn't work at all when dissidents do it. When the alt-right does it, it doesn't work. When anarchists do it, it doesn't work. When libertarians do it, it doesn't work. And I find it really weird that they still want to do this, even though it doesn't really help them out at all.
Can you name some ways you've seen it fail?
Well, I mean, there are the memes, so in that sense, it has generated a meme space online. But obviously, with the alt-right, especially with the more colorful demonstrations, it's backfired, like at Charlottesville, but even in other less exaggerated ways. And we've seen, the libertarians, they have all these like niche artists they'll have on, like, oh yeah, check this guy out, he's got some great, freedom art. I remember hearing that there's someone trying to crowdfund a libertarian comic where they're all libertarian superheroes, ANCAP superheroes. And it ultimately, I know what they're trying to do. They're trying to corner the superhero market, but they're just not going to have the cachet of Marvel or DC. And furthermore, they don't seem to understand how you need to use the medium, because libertarians tend to be very, especially anarcho-capitalists, tend to be very analytic. They want to go down every little jot and tittle. No step is left out. And you impose that kind of thinking onto comic book superheroes, it's kind of unimmersive. And so people who would read it because it's a comic book aren't going to necessarily read it because it feels like a lecture.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have figured out what Andrew Breitbart figured out, that politics is downstream of culture, and so they're hungry for power in a political sense, and so they're like, okay, we're gonna go upstream to the culture and just seize control of the means of production, which is sort of what happened with the SJWs at Marvel Comics.
Yes, and that's not working either.
and it backfired for them too, even though they had the full corporate power behind them. But I guess what all these people are failing to figure out is that there's some dynamic that works with the fans of the genre, and you can't just insert your political slogans into the genre and not expect to break it.
Yes.
It breaks the medium, and so I think all these, the people of every faction, if they're trying to promote their ideology through entertainment, they're going to have to really understand their genres a lot better and not break them in the process.
Well, what's interesting is one theory that I have is if you look at the shall we say, the decentralized forces in Western history battling the centralized forces and winning. So if you look at the Roman Empire, which is, the whole apparatus is imagery and pageantry, the theater, the games, bread and circus. Everybody's just kept busy with the sort of sensory overload, as far as the first century can have sensory overload, superficialities. And the pendulum swing from paganism to Christianity wasn't brought about because the Christians were better meme masters. It was because, to use, it's a bit anachronistic, but to use a left-wing jargon, they took direct action. And but the way they took direct action was there was a lot of people that the Roman Empire was not serving very well. And the Christians took direct action along with subsidiarity and solidarity to help these groups that had been dispossessed by the imperial system to get by and find meaning. And they were so good that many other people within the imperial system thought it was a better deal, eventually to the point where they had to co-opt it because they thought, well, this is just so revolutionary, so dangerous. We can't, it's better to have it under our control so we can at least guide it a little bit than have it outside the imperial structure. So there was a change of both Christianity and of the Roman Empire. And then we look at the 16th century with the Reformation. The Roman Catholic Church runs Europe much the same way, all this pageantry and images and sensory overload. And then the Reformers use the printing press. They kind of were meme masters with the printing press, but they then use direct action with the spoken word. So, because when you speak the word, it's kind of an equalizer. You could even see like the prophets in the Old Testament. Why are they so powerful? They didn't have this apparatus to make images and idols like the kings of Israel they were criticizing. And of course, the left is strongest when it's making a moral criticism of an unjust power structure. And that really isn't about packaging a narrative. It's about speaking truth to power, really doing it, not just pretending you're doing it. So I would say that these groups that don't have a lot of financial or political power, rather than trying to ape the entertainment industry of the establishment, sort of do shift the rules of the game, fight them on different terms that they're not good at. And what the system has not ever been good at is dealing with criticism of its corruption with a voice that can't be silenced or bought. And
the perfect example happened this year with Jeffrey Epstein didn't kill himself. Everyone was saying it.
Yeah. And so I would say that looking at the early, the prophets of the Old Testament, the early Christians, the reformers, we can sort of see how they dealt with this overweening power structures, some successfully, some not. But even if we look at the successes, it tended to be more through, again, to use left-wing jargon, direct actions, but the direct action being not the appropriation of the means of production, but through solidarity. And so, and most importantly, within the in-group, there's a lot of infighting amongst the left now, so it's not as useful.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how things shake out after the Democratic Party completely collapses and breaks into all its little factions, which I presume is going to happen this year. I'd be surprised if it didn't. And then there won't be this without the pressure to hold the coalition together. Everybody can go off in their own directions and do their own thing without trying to feign beliefs that they don't actually have.
Yeah, and I do think the Democratic Party's days are numbered. I mean, I don't know how it can come back together after what just happened, but I think to tie up in a bow all the stuff that I've been getting at is to go back to Baudrillard that you brought up earlier. those people who pursue a decentralized, autonomous way of life can only beat the empire by affirming reality and not the similitude, not the illusion that the empire creates. And I think a lot of times these autonomous, decentralized individualist groups get caught up in affirming the illusion.
Yeah, sometimes it seems almost hopeless that an emotionally compelling illusion is always going to beat out the facts. Like, facts don't care about your feelings, but conversely, feelings don't care about your facts, and emotions are what motivate people to take action, and facts just don't motivate anybody unless they attach an emotion to the fact. And that's why I kind of right now put most of my hope in the direction of some kind of a collapse. Hopefully not a devastating collapse, but I think people only really change their ways when they hit rock bottom and the old modes just don't work anymore. And that's why I really like what Allison Tiemann at Honey Badger Radio keeps saying about how uh, the narrative of the oppressive patriarchy is going to keep outselling all other ideas until it gets to the point where it completely threatens to destroy your society, and you just can't keep going forward by vilifying men anymore. And then that's the moment when there's possibility for some women to step forward and say, hey, let's construct a new meta narrative about our society and what our place in it means.
Yeah, now this collapse again. I think that the Democratic Party, it's kind of interesting how the coronavirus crisis, which is arguably a bigger crisis, has overshadowed the complete disintegration of the Democratic Party. The last 6 months, I kind of knew it had to happen sooner or later because of all the competing, contradictory interest groups, but I didn't expect to see it happen now and so fast. You know what I mean? It just happened so fast. And now that Bernie has essentially dropped out of the race and sort of been a good little boy and taking his medicine, a lot of his supporters are like, no, we're gonna light things on fire now. And I'm like, wow, okay, this is getting real.
Yeah, it's unprecedented times. I keep trying to find an analogy somewhere. Maybe history better than I do of something that parallels this this coronavirus lockdown. I just can't think of anything even vaguely like it. This where the depression is seems to be caused almost entirely just by government prohibition on economic activity, and we're all going to be poor now is the new mode. Um, um, and it definitely unprecedented times. Hopefully, can yield some unprecedented opportunities we haven't seen before.
Well, when you mentioned the collapse of the Democratic Party, I sort of, and then the factions breaking off and not having to hold frame with the narrative of the party, it reminded me of the sort of environmental analogy of an old growth tree getting struck down by lightning, allowing space for new, smaller trees to grow up and take its place. And I think the interesting thing will be to see what combination arises in the absence of this democratic old growth tree.
Yeah, I mean, my personal preference would be to get people to ignore party politics as much as possible going forward, because it's clearly just been a misery machine for people on both sides and the non-affiliated as well. Just no, it's just people just don't come out happier in the long run. It's just the dialogue just gets stupider and stupider. Um, I try to persuade people that electoral politics is just a sham to put a thin veneer of legitimacy on an oligarchy, and that every time you participate in that election system, you're rubber stamping the perpetuation of the same oligarchy. And and that we're not going to see a real creative breakthrough until we break out of this delusion that things are going to get better by playing the same game as before.
Well, yeah, and what's interesting too is all of the efforts to keep people in the electoral process. If we don't do X, Y will happen. Well, all these terrible things happened, and we were still involved in the political process. So clearly, being involved didn't thwart any of these warnings. In fact, you could argue that being involved in the process and made those warnings inevitable.
Yeah, I try in vain to get through to my friends who are outraged at Trump and are willing to vote for anybody, even a guy with extreme dementia, in order to get rid of Trump. That the reason we got Trump in the first place was through that very same system. That's the one that affirmed his legitimacy by their participation in that system, and all the all that I try to take a step back and see that that everyone involved in these political systems, they're just human beings with no special superpowers. It's the only reason they have any influence at all are these structures, and that we voluntarily participate in these structures. And if we don't like the outcome, these structures are just created through language and belief and habit. And if we just change the language, the beliefs, and the habits, the presidency, the government just evaporates overnight, because it never truly existed except as a construct of the mind.
And of course, that way of thinking about this problem, when Murray Rothbard talks about that and he points to the Discourse on Voluntary Servitude by Etienne Botti, and he points to how the Eastern Bloc countries just disintegrated because people lost faith in the communist system. Now, from maybe our point of view, what was defective is there was no real decentralized alternative, and the neoliberal order swept in place of the Soviet system. But so in one sense, understanding the sort of subjective psychological dynamics, libertarians, anarchists, and dissidents are fairly good at doing. What they're not good at doing is providing an alternative to replace the current system once it collapses.
Yeah, I've been really interested in alternatives, and just making lists of every viable alternative system I've heard of, and some of them are much more promising than others. But some of the ones I like are formal consensus, which is a way of replacing Robert's Rules of Order in order to make decisions as a group. If you have some kind of an organization, whether it be some kind of a company, or a activist group, or a municipal area, or like a New England town meeting or something like that. And another one I like a lot is dynamic facilitation, where you just bring a bunch of people together in a room with no agenda prepared ahead of time, and people just start talking, and someone writes down their ideas on a wall, and that process just continues and continues until everyone has said every idea that they have, and then they're all out of ideas, and then they get depressed for a little while. And that's a key part of the process, because out of that depression and doldrum, then they start to get creative and find ways to have win-win solutions for their conflicts, and it just sort of spontaneously bubbles up, and the group can come up with a breakthrough solution that they never would have thought of otherwise, because they were stuck in their preconceived notions. That's another one I like. Another one I like is as a way of replacing prisons and other kinds of punitive punishments, is the restorative justice models, where you bring together the offender and the victim, and together they kind of try to work out some mutually agreeable restitution. in a way that's meaningful, much more meaningful than serving a prison term. So those are kinds of things I find very promising, and hopefully those or some derivatives of them could form the basis of some kind of new, hopefully much better and saner society.
Yeah, well, we're nearly at the end of the hour, so I think it's about time to wrap up. Is there anything else you'd like to leave us with?
It's just that it's really interesting to get searching the internet for some of these breakthrough solutions that people have already come up with and have already had small scale models of, and I think by learning and experimenting with these new models, we can build a, to hit the cliche again, build a new society in the shell of the old one, because the old one is breaking down.
Well, thanks again, Nexus. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.